Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook through a YouTube link. So today we are joined again by our lovely Sydney. We're so happy to have you again. And we're going to be talking today about how to approach the topic of interpersonal violence with either friends, peers, family, people in your life, if it comes up. You know, if you're watching the news and a story comes up, if someone talks about someone that they know of who's experienced it, or even just attitudes about it can sometimes come into conversation. So this was an interesting topic that we were kind of discussing in preparation about like what directions we can go with this. And we wanted to start with like, why would we even need to have an episode about how to talk about these issues? And first and foremost, at least for me, I was thinking like, you know, I speak to students and strangers who I'm educating very differently about these issues than I would my friends or my family. When I talk to my friends, it's mostly people like the two of you, where it's very easy to talk about these issues because we're very like-minded, we do the work. Most of my friends are in this line of work or in a similar line of work. And even the ones who are not, like one of my best friends is in fashion, like it's not even related to this, but is just empathetic and really understanding and very receptive to like listening to these types of issues. Whereas even I think particularly with family, not so much. None of my family are in this kind of line of work. And I think come from different understandings, different backgrounds, different walks of life, how they approach these issues. So, and I think, you know, I'll pass it obviously to either of you to share the difficulties with that. But I think particularly for me, where I find challenging or challenges is talking with family about these issues.
Definitely. I agree. And I think, Holly, maybe you would understand it because of doing the counseling piece. Like you were saying, when Kara, when you're educating, you talk very differently. I would talk to a client very differently than I would like talk to a friend or my family members or something like that about this kind of stuff. You're just in a different space when you're like counseling, and you for the most part know that you're counseling someone who has experienced this. So it's a little bit different. And for me, to give like a personal thing, growing up, I was always, you know, my sisters always picked on me. You always know, you're such a know-it-all, blah, blah, blah. Like you think, you know, you're whatever. And so I have to really check myself when I'm like, I want to educate like my sisters or my parents on this thing because that's just problematic, or this thing that's on TV is not okay. But it's a funny dynamic for me because they're always like pretending, you know, since I was 5, you always pretend like you know everything. And I'm like, but this stuff, like I
actually do know, yeah.
This stuff I do know a lot about.
Listen to me. So I have to figure out how to navigate that conversation and not like put them off to like just shut their brains off. Like, oh, here Sydney goes again, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely connect with what you said, Sydney. I like find that like putting the counseling scope on things, even in my personal life, I try not to do it, but it's so hard when I'm met with like disinterest, or they're combating like my point of view, or they're like, oh, well, it's just TV. Oh, well, it's just a movie. And I'm like, well, like, let's talk about that. Right. And I kind of put the like counseling hat on in my family, and they're like, all right, we don't need a psychoanalyst, like go back to work. And I'm like, okay, but this is how I'm going to get you to listen. Like, this is how I feel like
understands it. Like,
yeah.
I'm like, this is my way of effectively communicating. And I don't know what to do when they're like, no.
Right.
And it's part of the problem when people have misinformation or negative attitudes that like shame or silence victims or survivors, even if it's an attitude about like what's depicted in a movie or a TV show. That's, you know, we've had episodes about like problematic movies, TV shows, songs, whatever. And that creates a culture that perpetuates the violence. So that's why it's important for us as advocates that it's not like you take your work hat off and then you're no longer an advocate. Like, you're an advocate by blood. It's in your life. It's in your daily life. It's in your personal life. But I totally relate to both of you. Like, I get the reaction of like, oh, here we go again. Like,
Yeah.
you know, the whatever names of like people, you know, like that self-righteous or whatever you want to call it. Like, I've gotten all those names too, Sydney, of like, oh my gosh, or politically correct. And,
yes, right.
and I think that's where it becomes challenging when it's family in particular. I don't get that as much from friends, peers.
No, yeah, I don't
And
know.
those who are not in this line of work. I've had very healthy discussions with friends who are, you know, in totally different lines of work, but have a lot of empathy and a lot of like willingness to discuss it. And we don't always leave, you know, on the same page, but I feel like it was at least productive and like a healthy discussion. Where sometimes with family, and I relate with Cindy, like, I am passionate. If anyone hasn't noticed from our Real Talk episodes, I am opinionated. I share my thoughts. I am pretty direct. And so I think I can curb that a little when I'm teaching, because I'm not trying to preach, right? It's not about preaching when I'm teaching with students or I'm teaching with an audience. It's about engaging in a dialogue. And I need to learn how to do that with my family, but it's hard because it's family. So the dynamics are different, personalities are different. You're going to get a response from a family member that's a lot more like unfiltered than, or, you know, someone who's curious about it. And don't get me wrong, I've had my fair share of like very difficult people in audiences wanting to give tons of pushback and tons of like challenging, difficult
things like that.
Yeah, like I outright victim blaming while I'm teaching, or outright saying like, you know, problematic things. But in those settings, I'm able to keep my hat on, you know, my educator hat on, and be like, well, let's dissect that a little bit, and like, tell me more about what you're thinking. But with family, I'm like, hey, what did you just say? You know, like,
I have like, it's an interesting thing because I notice too, I'm the same way. Like I react more to a family member or somebody close to me being victim blaming or whatever it might be than I would to somebody at work, because I can keep that hat on. And I remember, Cara, it was one of the things I said to you probably a year or so ago, because we were still in the office working in person. And I remember saying, like, I need to learn to approach these differences like in the way that you do, because I get so emotional and I get so like, but I think it's when it's family members and things like that, because I'm like, you are my people, like you are the people and like that are close to me. Hurts me more to think that way than, you know, the random like I want everyone to think in the ways that we do, but I don't take it personally when somebody that in my line of work misses the mark or says something wrong. But my go-to, like, this stuff is important to me, it matters, it's in my blood. So like when my parents say something or whatever, I'm like, oh, like it just like it's like it hits you right in the heart.
Totally
and like having to take that pause and be like, okay, like I want to explode on you because I feel responsible for how you are reacting right now, but I can't explode, and that's really hard.
Right, because then we're gonna get nowhere.
And if I exploded on, like, I go back to the counselor space, and I'm like, if I explode on a client when they say this, it's not gonna go anywhere. So will I explode on my parents? Probably, but I'm gonna try not to. Like,
human.
I'm like, I just try and like, I don't know, dissect how they're going to react. That's my way of doing it, is like, I try and break down each thing I'm going to say and see how they're going to react to what I say, and how can I turn it to make it something they'll understand. So I always, for my dad in particular, I love him, but he's just from a different generation, as I always say. And talking with him can be very frustrating, especially with victim blaming. I don't remember exactly what it was, but we were talking about a woman had come forward, and it had been 20 years maybe since the incident. And she came forward and she was like, yes, I was sexually assaulted by this person, like, and said it. And he was like, well, why'd she wait 10 years? Like he like invalidated her experience because it had been 20 years. And I was like, okay, but maybe when it happened, she wasn't comfortable. And I gave him all these things, and he's like, well, it's been 20 years. We can't really hold it against him now. And I'm like, nope, we can still hold it against him. I was like, if 20 years ago you robbed a bank and they found you robbing that bank now,
right,
would you expect them to hold you accountable? And he's like, well, yeah, I robbed a bank. And I was like,
same thing.
And
So
it's such an interesting thing. I've had the same kind of conversations with my dad. I'm thinking about when Dr. Ford came forward about
That's what I was thinking of.
Brett Kavanaugh case. I had that same conversation with my dad, and my mom did too, because he's, well, why is she coming forward now? And my mom and I both were like, well, what are you saying? Wait, hold on.
take a moment.
He's like, this is so awful that this happened to her. I can't believe she has to do this. But why did she wait so long? So like trying to figure out, like, I'm glad that you're acknowledging that this wasn't okay, but like, let's talk about this part of it too. Like, so
Yeah.
especially because the relationships we have with family members, we know where their hot buttons are, whatever you want to call it, that like you don't want to like, so you want to play to like what they're doing right too. You know, you gotta
Yeah.
Yeah.
Compliment sandwich almost. Like,
Yeah.
like I'm glad you acknowledge this. Here's where you're wrong, but thank you for listening. But it's true. I was thinking exactly the same situation. I remember seeing a lot of media response as well when she came forward saying like, you know, well, that was years ago. Why did she wait so long? And that's a really unfortunately common response
Right.
to particularly child sexual abuse victims. You know, I'm thinking about like Larry Nassar and no, not Larry Nassar. That was the so many.
Larry Nassar is gymnastics.
Yeah, I was thinking about the oh my gosh, the Michigan State.
Do you mean Penn State?
No.
Because Larry Nassar was Michigan State.
Oh.
Yeah.
Then wait, was it Penn State? Who was the other? There was another person who was sexually abusing particularly young boys.
That was Penn State.
What was his name? I can't believe I forgot it. I was literally going to watch the documentary on it too, like recently. Okay, as you look for it, I will go on. But I think of that case as well.
Gary Sandbusky.
Yes.
Sandusky. Thank you. Brain melt. Yeah. So I think about that case a lot in the sense of the young, and we talked about you know, in previous episodes about like identity and how that plays a role, particularly for male survivors and male survivors of child sexual abuse even. Like, oh my gosh, like the amount of cases that we probably don't even know about because particularly young boys are so silenced, and then men as they get older are carrying this, you know, secret because of the shame that is associated with it, even though it shouldn't be.
Right.
But I do think about that like reaction, right, when people are either not going to believe victims when they come forward or question why it took them so long. And so I get the same like heated kind of personal reaction of like, well, why would they feel comfortable coming forward sooner? Like, look at your response. That's part of the reason. You know, like,
sooner you would have had a different negative reaction, or you would have said something else that was blameful, or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's hard not to take it personally when you're in this work. We're all in this work for a reason, right? Whether you've experienced it yourself, whether you've seen people in your life experience it. And I mean, I think everyone knows someone who's experienced interpersonal violence, whether that's abuse or assault or whatever version of it, or, you know, severity of it. Every single person knows someone, whether they realize it or not.
Right.
But the people who do realize it, or the people who've experienced it themselves, don't just fall into this line of work, right? Like we're going to do another episode eventually about why we're advocates and why we do this work. But I think that's why, at least for me, is so personal when, like you said, when a family member says it, it's almost like you want to say to them, you should know better. You raised me, and I have these thoughts and feelings. It's almost like you want to say like, well, you should feel that way too. Whereas with a student, like when I'm teaching, I don't expect them to already be there. You know, or, and if they are, like, fantastic. And most are, I will say, like most students that I work with, and especially WCSU, I don't get a lot of pushback. I get a lot of students who are really, and if there is, they'll respond to each other in the classroom and be like, hold on, and they'll do it before I have to. But in your family, sometimes I think I feel I'm always the one who has to be like, ooh, hold on, let's talk about that, or like, ooh, that was problematic, but then get met with the, you know, here we go again, which is part of the problem.
I had someone say something to me the other day about like my relationship and asking like if my what did they say to me? They said, you know, because of your stuff or whatever, meaning like because of how important this work is to me and that I'm advocating for, you know, equal rights and feminism and stuff all the time. Like, does that get in the way of something?
Like, is that baggage?
Of me letting like my boyfriend pay for dinner? Like, do you let him do that, or does like your stuff get in the way? And I was like, first of all, like, I'm not certain that's your business. Second of all, I don't understand why. And I was talking about it with one of my best friends that somebody said that to me, and she was like, why does this stuff always happen to you? Like, why do people get mad at you for advocating for equality? Like, I don't understand. She's like, this is not the first time I've heard you talk about like somebody saying that it's, you know, almost pretending like it's a bad thing that you want to advocate for this stuff. And I'm like, because it is not. And it can be exhausting to like know that, you know, if I'm watching TV with family members or something, and I was watching Easy A last night, and like there's a scene in there that's assault, and I was like, when I was, you know, 10 years ago when the movie came out, didn't see it that way, but like last night, had I been watching that with family members and called it out, they'd been like, oh my God, like, you ruin everything. Not, they wouldn't have said you ruin everything, but like, you bring that negative perspective. I'm like, but that's what
it is.
It is what it is, yeah.
Right? Like, and I don't know why we don't talk about it.
I think that's
just
part
because
of
I'm naming it doesn't change the fact that it is that. I'm just putting a name on it.
Exactly.
And naming it is helpful in taking it apart, but people are uncomfortable with taking it apart. So they're like, well, why'd you have to bring attention to it? We could have ignored it.
Right.
And that's exactly where I think the next part of the conversation can go, is like, why people's responses are victim blaming. Why do people respond with, oh, why do we have to talk about this? And I think generally, you know, and it's going to be different depending on your culture. It's going to be different depending on your family dynamic. It's going to be different depending on people's personalities. But I think generally when you're met with resistance when talking about these issues, I think it comes from a place of discomfort in that they're feeling threatened somehow. Their privilege is being threatened. Their autonomy is being threatened, because they're thinking to themselves, well, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't let that happen. I think I hear that a lot when people are like, well, why didn't they fight them off? Why didn't they yell for help? Why didn't they call the police? Da, 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 da. Those responses, I think, are coming from a place of like, I want to be in control. And if I was in control in that moment, I wouldn't let that happen, because it's a misunderstanding of what sexual violence or domestic violence can look like. And so I think it comes from a place of like fear of, if you're saying that no matter what somebody is wearing, that assault can still happen to them, no matter how safe somebody is, no matter how educated somebody is, no matter all the decisions they make to keep themselves safe, that it can still happen, then you're saying it could happen to me, or you're saying that, you know, I could be in that situation. And that's a scary thought and really uncomfortable for people to sit with. So they would rather put the blame and say, well, they put themselves in that situation, and that's something I wouldn't do.
Right.
So that's kind of where my head went.
That's a really interesting perspective that I kind of hadn't like thought about like so all the way through before. And I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and I definitely think by breaking down that barrier, it brings that issue a lot closer to home. Because like, I know when I speak with my family members and I try and make it like a personal thing, I'm like, okay, well, like, let's say this happened to my sister, or let's say this happened to my brother. How would you feel? Like, how would you react? Would you have the same reaction? And like, bringing it into the personal, like, my family is just like, oh, no, I don't like that. Like, it didn't happen to us. It happened to them. They're the ones at fault. And I'm like, but it's not. And it's just, I think you make a good point with saying that it's a control piece, because like a lot of people do like to feel in control of their lives. And as soon as you start to question the system or question the way things work, you are affecting the control they have over situations.
Yeah, so they keep it at a distance because it's easier to do that. It's easier to say it happens to other people. It's easier to say, and I think about that with human trafficking, you know, of people just totally still denying the fact that it happens in Connecticut, in Danbury, in the US even. People are still like, no, that doesn't happen here. That wouldn't happen to someone I know. And that was what I heard a lot growing up. And, you know, where I grew up in Connecticut was like, oh, dating abuse, that doesn't happen in our town, or like, you know. So I think people like to keep it at a distance because they don't want to believe that they know someone. But if they look at their life, and that's why I said it earlier, like I can almost guarantee with like every cell in my body that every single human being knows someone. who has been impacted by either domestic violence, dating abuse, sexual assault, child sexual abuse. Like, it is just, whether they know it or not.
Right.
It's just so prevalent. There's no way you
it's
have
so
it.
not talked about. And that's part of the, problem.
Totally.
I always say this is the taboo side of psychology.
Ooh.
Nobody really wants to put a name on it because it's uncomfortable. Talking about sexual assault and talking about sexual violence with children, with adults, talking about domestic violence, it's breaking that barrier of what is safe and what is not.
Yeah.
And when you have to talk about it, everybody's like, "Ooh, whoa, hold on."
Mm-hmm.
And there's just been such like the same narrative for so long that it's taboo at this point. You don't bring it up.
Right.
Oh, it's so true. And I think like speaking from that place of like everyone knows someone, whether they know it or not, that is part of my motivation to always call it out. And because like it would be really easy to say, okay, this is going to piss people off if I say that this is what it is, so let me just swallow it and like move on. But like I don't always know who's in the room. I don't always know what's going on. And if I know something and I pretend not to see it, like that's not okay. Like it's different when I was saying I was watching Easy A last night. Like my friend who I live with that I was watching it with, like we're very much on the same wavelength with this kind of stuff. So it wasn't like we needed to really talk about it because I knew she saw it and I knew, I saw it and whatever, but you never know like what people have been through. So it is important to kind of call it out, especially, we talk about family and it's not always safe to have these conversations. But if when we say bystander intervention, right? Like if you're not putting yourself at risk in terms of like your own physical safety, like call it out, get involved. Emotional safety too.
Yes, that too.
I'm thinking about the episode we recorded about going home for the holidays and stuff like that, and when is it okay or not to like call something out or say that you're uncomfortable. So obviously you want to take stock of like what's happening around you, but like if you're safe, calling something out that you see on TV or, in a song or whatever, like it's important to intervene.
Yeah. So let's talk about
Oh
yeah, sorry, go ahead, Holly.
And just finding your own comfortability level with that. I mean, you might not be comfortable calling out something in a movie when you're with a group of people, but if you hear it in a song, you can be like, oh, well, like that's not okay. And just like finding where you're comfortable. Because that's where it's going to be most effective. I
like that. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. And your comment earlier of like the bringing it kind of close to home and saying like, well, how would you feel if this happened? Made me think of if we can pivot to start to wrap up the conversation about the techniques of bystander intervention, because that was the first one I thought of, is what we call making it personal. So that is a bystander intervention technique to essentially almost, I see it as like forcing empathy or attempting to force empathy by saying, how would you feel if someone you cared about was experiencing this? And so if you're, watching a movie and someone, a friend, a peer, a partner, a family member makes a comment of like, oh, well, look at what they're wearing. Of course they would get catcalled. I don't know, just as an example. You can then respond by saying, if you feel comfortable, well, how would you feel if that was me in that situation? Or how would you feel if that was your brother or your cousin or whatever? And so that for making it personal kind of helps sometimes, unfortunately, because just the way we work, that like we're more likely to stand up for someone that we know than for a stranger. So they're more likely to think about, well, if I was next to you walking on the street and someone catcalled you, I would absolutely defend you, or I would absolutely check in to make sure you're okay. So I think that technique can be really effective if it's someone that you know, by making it personal.
Totally. And I think you just said another one too, checking in with someone, like about like if you see what's happening, that's another technique, right? Like if you do know who's in the room, or if we're all saying like we're always the one calling it out, like I think my family and certainly my friends are at the point where they'd be like, oh, Sydney would hate that if she saw that. Like checking in with someone and like, are you okay? I know that wasn't cool that like that just happened, or that we saw that on TV or whatever. And just, getting a temperature check on how whatever it is landed with the people that are around you.
Yeah. I think another one that's really good for people that people that you're close with, is what we call like appealing to their best self. So if someone makes a problematic comment or, says something that you don't agree with that is kind of perpetuating victim blaming or shaming or whatever it is, appealing to their best self means like saying something along the lines of, hey, I know that you're trying to come across as funny, or I know that you're a really good person, but what you just said is like really not okay, and I feel uncomfortable by it, or something like that. So it's trying to say like, I recognize that you don't mean any harm by what you're saying, but it is harmful. And so it's trying to acknowledge that they're not intending to hurt others. Because sometimes people will get defensive of like, oh, I didn't mean it that way, whatever, and try to throw in the like, oh, you're so sensitive, oh, politically correct, I can't say anything. But so trying to say like, no, like you're a really smart person and I respect you, and I think really highly of you, but what you just said right there was problematic and harmful. So that can, depending on the relationship you have with someone, can be really effective.
Definitely.
I'm thinking, I don't know the exact like intervention technique that it might be called, but like it's along the same kind of lines of what you were just talking about, but just almost being totally direct. Like I had somebody make a rape joke one time, and like I heard it, and when I processed it, I went, that was a rape joke. And they went, you're right, I shouldn't have said that, I'm sorry. And then we
just like naming it,
done, and it was over. And I think sometimes people just need like a reminder, or they've not thought of it in that way, as like this is perpetuating rape culture or whatever. So it can be really quick and simple, and like in the time it took me to react, it was over, So it again depends on the relationship and that dynamic that you might have with that person, but that is another tool, and hopefully people will respond and say, you're right, I shouldn't have said that, I won't do it again.
It's called being direct. So that's what we call it, at least. So you were spot on.
I feel like being direct is, I mean, for me at least, in my experiences, being direct has been the most helpful with my friends. With family, I think forcing empathy, 1000%.
Yes, I agree.
It kind of pushes them into that protector role, and they have to go into the mindset of, oh, well, if this was my life,
right.
They have to be put in that protector role. But being direct with my friends is definitely the quickest way, because I mean, I'd like to think I'm a pretty direct person, so they kind of expect that.
Yeah.
And if I just call them out on it, they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. And if they're not like, yeah, you're right, they're like, oh, well, it was just a joke. And I'm like, well, it's not something we should be joking about. Like, why is this not something we should be joking about? Because it's somebody else's lived experience. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah.
You can't make jokes at the expense of others.
And I'm glad you mentioned that some techniques are going to work better with friends, some techniques are going to work better with families. And like, I think it's really important to recognize too, and I'm sure we all know this deep down, but telling our audience that it's not easy to do these things. That's why we're having this episode, is because we recognize that talking, and whether just talking about the issues in conversation, and or when you're faced with pushback or kind of resistance, or someone says something problematic and you want to call it out, it's really challenging. It can hurt relationships. I think it can make people feel like, I don't know, I'm going back to the beginning of the conversation of how we were saying, like, we're called names, or it's the rolling the eyes of like, here we go again. Like, that's hurtful, because it's not like you're just saying it for the sake of causing an argument. You're saying it because you believe in what's right and you care about people and their well-being. And so you're fighting for equality, but you're fighting for, and so I think just to my final thought about it all is like, we're sharing all these tips and techniques, but like by no means does this mean that it's going to be easy. And it's also never going to be a one and done. Like, I think about even the anti-racist work that we're doing, and like at the Women's Center and as individuals, that it's not like oh, I did it, now I'm an anti-racist, or oh, I did it, now I fought for equality for people, survivors of violence. It's like, it's ongoing. You're going to have probably multiple conversations with people that are going to be difficult and going to be uncomfortable, but every time that you do that, you're standing up for survivors. Every time that you do that, you're creating a safer culture for people who are experiencing this. And like Sydney was saying before, you never know who's in the room, so you might be standing up for someone that you don't even know you're standing up for. that you care about.
And now that person knows they have an ally in you, or that they can go to you. And I think that is a huge part of like just making people feel supported, even when they may have never disclosed to you before, but you're advocating for them without even realizing it. And now they know they have another person they can go to.
Yeah. I just did a post about that on our social media a little while ago. That was something like, you know, if you're the person saying like, well, they were asking for it, or what did they expect, or, you know, they need to just move on, whatever, like, you don't know who's listening. So if there's a survivor in your life, yeah, like if there's a survivor in your life, they're listening to you, they hear you, and they're going to know that you're not a safe person to go to. So yeah, say it for the people that you don't know, say it for the people that you do, making it personal. Say it for the people that you do know, say it for the people that are in your life that you may not even know have experienced this, but are listening.
Yeah. And I think like, I'm not at the Women's Center anymore, but this is a part of the work that I do. And I know the work that you all do. And the three of us have the tools and the language to have these conversations because of the work that we've been doing. And it's still hard. We're all saying it's still not easy, but students can come to the Women's Center, access support to figure out how to have those conversations, whether it's attending an event or coming in for counseling. You know, I always used to say like things don't have to reach crisis level for people to access our supports. Like these are conversations, what is healthy, what is not, and learning these skills and these tools are things that the Women's Center can help people with, especially college students on campus. I feel like WestCon has that like culture of like wanting to support survivors, and it's amazing, and was one of my favorite parts of being there. And like, but how do we give people the tools, and let's, you know, try to do that together, I think is a cool thing, a cool resource that the Women's Center provides.
Totally. Yeah. Any final thoughts?
No.
We're like, we're done.
I feel like
I'm exhausted.
That's it. No. I feel like it's just I feel like we've said it very well. You guys have articulated it very well, but it's just important to stand in your truth and allow a safe space to be created around you just by being an advocate in every part of your life. It's not easy, but it will help.
Yeah.
Which
Perfect. Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, to echo what Cindy was saying, that even for people who like us who are in this work, it is still difficult. So if you need help processing that, or if you know, are also dealing with some similar challenges and things, you know, we're here for you. So don't hesitate to reach out for support and to kind of process any of that. And this episode obviously is one of our Real Talk episodes being recorded and released on our IGTV, on our Facebook or YouTube, so you can access it anytime. Use it as, you know, the conversation piece if you want. But we're always looking for feedback, so please, you know, let us know your thoughts if you have comments, questions, suggestions, and please share with a friend. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And stay safe. Stay well.
yes.
Bye.